Picture this. It's April 15th, 1912. The Titanic is sinking. 1,500 people are about to die in the freezing Atlantic. And somewhere, in a quiet office in London or New York, a man in a suit is doing math. Not mourning, not praying, calculating. Because while the world was about to lose a ship and mourn the dead, someone else was about to get very, very rich. This is the story they don't teach you in school. The story of who actually profited when the Titanic went down. The headlines scream tragedy. The unsinkable ship destroyed on its maiden voyage. 1,500 lives lost. Families shattered. But behind the grief and shock, something else was happening. Something that rarely makes it into the history books. The Titanic disaster was also a business event. Money shifted hands. Shares rose and fell. Companies positioned themselves to profit from one of the most famous catastrophes in modern history. The question we almost never ask is devastatingly simple. Who actually benefited? Because where there is loss on a massive scale, there is almost always profit hidden in the shadows. And the Titanic? It created fortunes. To understand this, we need to step into the financial world of the early 20th century. The Titanic was operated by the White Star Line, a British shipping company. But White Star wasn't some small family business. It was part of the International Mercantile Marine Company, IMM, a giant shipping trust backed by none other than J.P. Morgan, the most powerful banker in America at the time. Morgan had spent years consolidating transatlantic shipping under his control, buying up companies and merging them into a single empire that would dominate the North Atlantic routes. White Star was the crown jewel in that empire, and the Titanic was its proudest vessel. The sinking, then, wasn't just a human catastrophe. It was a financial earthquake for IMM. Shares in the company plunged immediately after the news broke. Investors panicked. Lawsuits loomed on the horizon. Survivors and families of the dead filed claims worth millions, and insurance companies braced for massive payouts. But here's where the story gets interesting. IMM had already been struggling before the Titanic ever left port. The company was heavily indebted. Morgan's trust had overextended itself, and competition with Cunard, White Star's great rival, was fierce. The Titanic disaster, ironically, gave IMM a reason to renegotiate, restructure, and tap into sympathy from both the public and governments. In a twisted way, the catastrophe gave Morgan cover to reorganize his entire shipping empire. Crisis became opportunity. And let's not forget the insurance companies themselves. The Titanic was insured for about £1 million, roughly $120 million in today's money. Lloyd's of London, along with dozens of smaller insurers, paid out the claims. For some, this was devastating. A handful of underwriters went bankrupt, but the larger firms like Lloyd's weathered the hit and gained even more dominance afterward. The disaster wiped out weaker competitors, leaving the strongest players with a bigger market share. In finance, sometimes paying out is simply the cost of consolidation. The small fish die. The big fish get bigger. Meanwhile, the media world saw an absolute boom. Newspapers around the globe printed extra editions, feeding a public hungry for every detail. The New York Times sold out issue after issue with its Titanic coverage, gaining prestige and subscribers in the process. Across Europe and America, the Titanic story sold more papers than any event since the assassination of President McKinley in 1901. Publishers profited directly from the disaster, and the Titanic became a case study in how tragedy could drive media empires forward. But the profits didn't stop there. The Titanic sparked an explosion in books, lectures, and later films that kept generating revenue for decades. Within months, memoirs by survivors were on sale. Traveling exhibitions displayed Titanic artifacts. Even vaudeville theaters staged dramatizations of the sinking. Each retelling turned the tragedy into a commercial product, feeding both public fascination and private profit. The disaster became an industry in itself. Long before James Cameron's blockbuster made billions at the box office, grief, it turned out, was incredibly marketable. And then there was Cunard. White Star's rival had been struggling against Morgan's IMM. But the Titanic disaster shifted public opinion overnight. Cunard's liners, like the Lusitania and Mauritania, were suddenly seen as safer, more reliable, and better managed. Passengers voted with their wallets. In the years immediately after the sinking, Cunard gained significant market share, attracting customers who no longer trusted White Star. The tragedy of the Titanic, in effect, became a competitive advantage for its rival. It was a brutal reminder that in business, one company's disaster is often another's golden opportunity. Yet the story goes deeper still. Shipbuilders like Harland and Wolff, who had constructed the Titanic in Belfast, initially faced questions about design and safety. But rather than collapse under the scrutiny, they adapted. The demand for safer ships skyrocketed. New regulations required more lifeboats, stronger hulls, and better safety protocols. Harland and Wolff and other shipbuilders received lucrative contracts to refit existing vessels and design new ones to meet the new standards. What began as a scandal became an opportunity for growth. Safety suddenly was extremely profitable, and this points us toward the larger lesson hidden in the Titanic's financial aftermath. Disasters rarely destroy capital completely. They redistribute it. Some lose, others win. Insurance companies consolidate. Rivals gain market share. Media thrives. Manufacturers pivot to meet new demand. Behind every headline about tragedy, there is a balance sheet where someone is counting gains as well as losses. The Titanic also created one of the earliest global examples of disaster capitalism. The phrase wouldn't be coined until the 21st century, but the mechanics were already visible in 1912. The world was shocked, grieving, and demanding change. And into that storm stepped companies ready to provide solutions at a price. Life jacket manufacturers, lifeboat producers, and naval engineering firms suddenly had booming markets. Governments scrambled to regulate, and regulation meant contracts, retrofits, and new spending. Every new law requiring more safety equipment translated directly into revenue for the firms that could provide it. For families mourning the dead, this may have felt like progress. But for the financial historian, it reads as a textbook case study in how fear and tragedy create profitable demand. The longer-term ripple effects extended even further. J.P. Morgan's shipping trust struggled for years but didn't collapse immediately. Instead, the Titanic's loss became one chapter in a long story of corporate decline and restructuring. By the 1930s, White Star merged with Cunard, its former rival, under pressure from the British government. Investors who had once bet on Morgan's dream of a shipping monopoly saw their fortunes fade, but Cunard White Star emerged as a stronger, consolidated entity. Again, catastrophe didn't end the business. It merely reshaped it. The cultural commercialization of Titanic was just beginning. Survivors toured lecture circuits, telling their stories for money. Authors published best-selling books. Silent films appeared within months. One of the earliest, Saved from the Titanic, starred actual survivor Dorothy Gibson and was rushed into theaters just 29 days after the sinking. It made money from the raw grief of audiences still processing the event. Over the decades, the Titanic story became an intellectual property unto itself, generating profits for publishers, film studios, and eventually global entertainment giants. By the late 20th century, the Titanic brand was worth billions, culminating in the 1997 film that earned over $2 billion at the box office. The irony is staggering. What began as a disaster for one company became a fountain of revenue for countless others who had nothing to do with the ship's construction or voyage. And here lies the uncomfortable truth. Even tragedy can be financialized. Human suffering becomes content. Loss becomes leverage. The Titanic wasn't just a maritime disaster. It was an economic event, a reminder that in our financial system, nothing is immune to commodification. The same system that turned war into bonds, famine into trade, and empire into balance sheets also turned a shipwreck into a business opportunity. Now let's connect this to today. When Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans in 2005, construction firms, private contractors, and security companies profited massively from the rebuilding process. When the 2008 financial crisis destroyed trillions in household wealth, hedge funds and distressed asset buyers scooped up bargains and grew exponentially richer. During the COVID-19 pandemic, entire industries suffered. Airlines, small businesses, service workers, while tech giants, pharmaceutical companies, and logistics firms multiplied their market caps several times over. In every disaster, the pattern repeats. Some lose everything, but others, often those closest to capital and government contracts, find ways to profit. The Titanic is not a relic. It is a blueprint. And the lesson is deeply personal. Financial education isn't just about learning how to save or invest. It's about recognizing these systemic patterns. When you see tragedy or crisis, you should be asking, who is quietly gaining? Which companies are securing contracts, expanding market share, or leveraging fear into sales? Because history shows us that in every global crisis, from wars to pandemics to shipwrecks, money is never idle. It shifts. And if you don't see where it's moving, you are the one being left behind. So which companies profited from the Titanic disaster? The answer is many. Insurers who consolidated their market, rivals who gained passengers, shipbuilders who won new contracts, newspapers that sold millions of copies, authors, lecturers, filmmakers, and eventually global entertainment companies that turned the shipwreck into one of the most valuable cultural brands in history. White Star lost a ship. 1,500 people lost their lives. But capital never dies. It simply finds a new vessel. That is the harsh reality of economic history. Tragedy is real, human suffering is real, but so is the machinery of money and power that converts disaster into opportunity. Understanding that pattern is the only way to protect yourself, because whether it's the Titanic, a financial bubble, or the next global crisis, the same question always lingers in the background. Who's profiting while everyone else is sinking? History doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. And if you don't understand those rhymes, you'll keep mistaking tragedy for chaos instead of recognizing it for what it often is, a carefully managed transfer of wealth. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers, and I'll show you where to look.